So, think about this for a second. If a surgeon amputates a patient's infected leg to save their life, is that an act of cruelty or is it, an act of profound mercy?
Right, it's a pretty jarring question to start with.
Yeah, it really is. But, I mean, think about the sheer optics of it. To anyone standing in that operating room without context, taking a bone saw to a human limb looks like absolute barbarism.
Oh, absolutely. It looks incredibly violent.
It is violent. It's deeply destructive to the individual's body, and it causes immense immediate pain. But because the patient survives the infection, right, because the rod is stopped before it can spread to the vital organs and kill the host entirely, we view the surgeon not as a monster, but as a savior.
Exactly. We basically accept the localized brutality because of the systemic survival it secures.
Right. And today, we are going to take that exact same framework, the idea of necessary localized brutality for the sake of systemic survival, and apply it to one of the most controversial, misunderstood, and fiercely debated subjects in human history.
Which is the mechanics of political power.
Yes. Welcome to today's deep dive. If you love gaining knowledge quickly but thoroughly, without feeling overwhelmed, you are in the right place.
Because it is a framework that forces us to completely discard our modern moral compass, well, at least temporarily, just understand a very specific, deeply pragmatic worldview.
Yeah, and that's hard to do.
It is. I mean, when we look at leadership, whether in a historical kingdom or like a modern organization, we're conditioned to evaluate actions based on their immediate kindness.
Right, we're taught that good leaders are gentle, they're accommodating, they're merciful.
Exactly. But the perspective we are examining today suggests that this modern conditioning is not just naive, but fundamentally dangerous.
Wait, dangerous.
Yeah. It argues that what we often call mercy is just a cowardly refusal to make the hard choice. And what we condemn as cruelty is often the only mechanism that actually prevents mass suffering.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yep.
Because to explore this, we are looking at a stack of notes and excerpts centered entirely on one specific, highly influential document.
A very famous document.
Very famous. We are dissecting Chapter 17 of Machiavelli's classic political text, The Prince, specifically focusing on his analysis of cruelty versus mercy.
And, of course, his answer to the eternal leadership question, is it better to be loved than feared?
Right, the big ones.
It's a question that has haunted leaders for over 500 years. But, to truly understand the answer provided in the text, we have to establish the core mission of our analysis today.
Which is super important for you listening because we have to strip away the centuries of historical and cultural baggage attached to this author.
Yeah, I mean, the author's name has literally become an adjective for evil, deceptive, and ruthless behavior. If you call someone Machiavellian today, you are insulting their character.
You're calling them a snake.
Basically, yeah. But our goal here is to impartially analyze exactly what the author wrote, not what pop culture says he wrote.
And we should make it very clear right now, we are not endorsing these ruthless strategies. We are not taking any political sides or saying, hey, this is how you should live your life.
Definitely not. We are dissecting this text to understand a highly pragmatic, deeply cynical, yet historically significant view of human nature and power dynamics.
Exactly. We are looking at the blueprint.
Sure.
If you want to understand how a highly pragmatic, unsentimental leader views the world, you have to read the manual they operate from.
So true.
So let's dive right into the opening argument of the chapter, because it really doesn't waste any time. It presents us with what looks like a paradox right out of the gate.
Yeah, it makes this wildly counterintuitive claim.
Right. It states that, of course, every leader should desire to be seen as merciful and not cruel, which sounds standard enough. You want a good reputation.
Sure, everyone does.
But then the text immediately pivots and issues this severe warning. It says a leader must be incredibly careful not to use this mercy badly.
And that phrase is the crux of his entire philosophy on the subject. Use this mercy badly.
What does he mean by using mercy badly?
Well, what he is establishing there is that mercy is not an inherent virtue. It is not an absolute good. Mercy, in this political framework, is a tool.
Oh, interesting. Like a lever you pull.
Exactly like a lever. And like any tool, if you use it incorrectly, if you pull the lever at the wrong time in the wrong situation, it causes absolute destruction.
So he's completely redefining the word.
Yes.
Yeah.
Today, we think of mercy as a feeling like compassion, empathy, the emotional capacity to forgive someone who has wronged you.
Right.
But the text redefines mercy as an outcome. True mercy is measured by the stability and peace it produces, regardless of the harshness required to achieve it.
Okay, to prove this, the notes point to a fascinating comparative case study the text uses. It looks at two vastly different historical examples.
Let's start with the first one, Cesare Borgia.
Right. Now, based on the historical context provided here, Borgia was universally considered cruel. This wasn't like a secret.
No, he had a widespread, unshakable reputation for brutality.
But the text argues that his cruelty actually had a profoundly positive outcome. Through his harsh, unyielding actions, he restored the region of the Romagna. He united it, and he brought it back to peace and faith.
And this is where the surgeon analogy you brought up perfectly maps onto the text's logic. Borgia is the surgeon.
Ah, okay.
The region of the Romagna was suffering from the political equivalent of a systemic infection. It was fractured, chaotic, and essentially bleeding out.
So Borgia comes in, and he doesn't try to negotiate with the infection.
Nope. He doesn't show compassion to the warlords causing the chaos. He uses the political bone saw.
Wow.
He executes, he punishes, he utilizes intense targeted cruelty to amputate the chaotic elements. And because he does that, the infection stops. The region unites. Peace is restored.
Therefore, the text argues Borgia's cruelty was, in actual functional reality, an act of supreme mercy to the broader population who just wanted to live in peace.
Exactly.
Which brings us to the counterexample, right? The foil to Borgia. The text contrasts him with the Florentine people.
And the notes indicate that the leaders of Florence desperately wanted to maintain a reputation for goodness.
They wanted to escape any name for cruelty. They were fundamentally obsessed with keeping their hands clean.
Right. So they were faced with a crisis in a city they controlled called Pistoia. Between the years 1500 and 1502, Pistoia was being torn apart by factional disputes. Riots were breaking out. Absolute chaos.
And Florence, because they wanted to be merciful and didn't want to send in the troops to harshly crack down on the instigators, essentially did nothing.
They refused to intervene forcefully.
And the result? They allowed the city of Pistoia to be completely destroyed by its own internal violence.
This is where the author absolutely brings down the hammer on conventional morality. I mean, he looks at Florence, the people who wanted to be seen as the good guys, and he looks at Borgia, the famous tyrant.
Yeah.
And he asserts that Borgia was actually more merciful than the Florentine people. Florence's desire to feel merciful was a selfish vanity that resulted in mass destruction.
Let's break down the textual analysis on this, because the author uses very specific language to justify this utilitarian math.
He does.
The text says that allowing disorders to continue, which is exactly what Florence did by doing nothing, leads to widespread killings and robberies. And these widespread disorders, the text argues, hurt the whole universality.
And that phrase, the whole universality, means the entire community.
Right. The innocent civilians, the merchants, the farmers, everyone suffers when chaos is allowed to reign unchecked.
Precisely. Chaos is a fire that burns the entire forest. Whereas a leader's harsh, targeted executions, according to the text, only hurt one particular person.
Right. If you execute the 5 ringleaders of a riot, you are inflicting immense cruelty on those 5 specific individuals.
But you extinguish the fire. You save the forest.
The author is basically calculating the total volume of human suffering.
Exactly. Is it better to take the moral burden of executing 5 instigators upon your own conscience? Or is it better to sit back, keep your conscience sparkling clean, and watch 500 innocent people lose their homes, their livelihoods, and their lives in the resulting chaos?
He's arguing that taking that moral burden, the willingness to dirty your own hands and be called cruel, is the actual sacrifice required of a true leader.
Yes. Weak leaders avoid the execution to protect their own self-image, thereby washing their hands of the hundreds who die in the ensuing anarchy.
Think about how this applies beyond 16th century Italian city-states for a second. Think about a modern organizational structure.
Okay, let's hear it.
So, you manage a department, and you have one incredibly toxic employee. This person is brilliant, maybe, but they are manipulative, they pit team members against each other, and they are completely ruining the morale of a 20-person department.
It is a scenario that plays out in almost every industry on a daily basis.
Right, and firing that person is harsh, it feels cruel, especially if they have a family or if they've been there a long time. You don't want to be the bad guy.
Nobody wants to have that agonizing conversation in the HR office.
Exactly. So you choose mercy. You let them stay, hoping they will change. You put them on an endless improvement plan.
And what happens?
The whole universality of your team suffers. The good, quiet, hardworking people become miserable, some of them quit, the overall project fails.
Because in your desperate desire to not look cruel to that one particular toxic person, you actually inflicted a massive amount of stress, anxiety, and professional chaos on 20 innocent people.
Exactly. And this exposes the uncomfortable truth the text is trying to force us to confront. It demands that we ask ourselves, are we being merciful because it genuinely improves the situation, or are we being merciful simply because it protects our own ego?
Do we just want to avoid the discomfort of conflict?
Yes. The text aggressively strips away the moral high ground from the passive leader. It tells you that your desire to keep your hands clean, your desire to be liked, is actually an act of supreme selfishness if it results in greater chaos for the collective you are supposed to be protecting.
By refusing to be cruel to the instigator, you are inadvertently being incredibly cruel to the innocent majority.
It fundamentally reframes the idea of accountability.
It really does.
So if targeted cruelty is sometimes mathematically more merciful than weak mercy, why does the text single out new leaders? Because the author makes a very distinct shift here.
He does. He moves from general leadership principles to the highly specific hypervolatile scenario of newly acquired power.
The text explicitly asserts that it is fundamentally impossible for a new prince to escape a name for cruelty.
And the operative word there is impossible.
Right, not just unlikely.
Yeah, the author isn't saying a new leader might have to be cruel or that they should consider it. He is saying it is an inescapable reality of their position.
And the justification he gives is that new states are full of dangers.
To understand why he believes this so rigidly, we have to look at the mechanics of a power vacuum.
Okay.
Transitioning into power is inherently the most unstable moment in any political or organizational life cycle. When a new leader takes over, whether that's a prince conquering a new territory or, a CEO being brought in from the outside to turn around a failing company, the old order is dead. The previous rules, the established hierarchies, the implicit agreements of the past regime are all dissolved. But the new order hasn't set yet. The concrete is still wet.
Oh, I like that. The concrete is still wet. And in that wet concrete, everyone is trying to leave their mark.
Exactly. The loyalists of the old regime are quietly looking for weaknesses to exploit so they can regain their lost status.
And the opportunistic allies who help the new leader get into power are now expecting massive rewards, and they are testing the boundaries to see how much they can grab for themselves.
So if a new leader steps into that highly volatile testing environment and tries to be universally gentle, accommodating, and merciful, the text argues they will instantly be devoured.
Their gentleness will be read as weakness.
Yes, and the various factions will tear the state apart trying to seize control.
And to elevate this point from simple political strategy to something approaching a tragic universal law, the author employs a fascinating literary device.
He quotes ancient poetry.
Yeah, he pulls a line from Virgil's Aeneid, specifically spoken by the character Dido, the Queen of Carthage.
And the quote translates to, "The harshness of things and the newness of the kingdom compel me to contrive such things, and to keep a broad watch over the borders."
It's such a striking inclusion. You have this dense, pragmatic, deeply unsentimental handbook on the mechanics of power, and suddenly he weaves in classical tragedy.
But look at the specific language Dido uses.
Right, she says, compel me. She doesn't say, I enjoy contriving such things, or I want to keep a harsh watch.
She is compelled by the newness of the kingdom.
It frames this initial cruelty, this necessary paranoia, not as a malicious character flaw of the leader, but as a tragic, inescapable burden imposed by the environment itself.
The structure of a new state demands harshness. The borders are untested. The loyalty of the subjects is entirely unproven.
Therefore, keeping a broad watch, being suspicious, setting up strict defenses, it's framed as the only rational response to an inherently dangerous ecosystem.
Exactly. It attempts to absolve the new leader of the moral guilt of their harshness. It basically tells them, you are not a tyrant by choice, you are a guardian by necessity.
However, this is where the text introduces a vital counterweight, right? Because if it stopped there, it would simply be an instruction manual for unhinged tyranny.
It would just justify endless paranoia.
Exactly. But the text provides a crucial caveat, a behavioral governor that it calls the temperate mode.
Despite this pressing, undeniable need to keep a broad watch and utilize harshness to establish order, the text explicitly warns that the leader must be slow to believe and to move.
Let's dissect that phrase. Slow to believe and to move. It means when the inevitable rumors of treason or incompetence reach your desk and in a new state, those rumors will be constant. You cannot just react on instinct.
You must proceed in a temperate mode with prudence and humanity.
The author is describing an incredibly difficult psychological tightrope that the leader must walk.
It is a masterclass in emotional regulation and calibrated perception. He defines the exact boundaries of failure on either side of this tightrope.
So if you lean too far to one side, if you operate with too much confidence, you become what he calls incautious.
Right. Incautious meaning reckless, overly optimistic.
You assume that because you are in charge, everyone naturally respects you. You start trusting the wrong people too quickly.
You ignore the hidden dangers, you dismiss the quiet plotting of the old loyalists, and eventually you walk right into a trap and lose your power because you were willfully blind to the threats.
You are too fast to believe in the goodness of your situation.
Precisely. That is the danger of excessive confidence.
Mm.
But the danger on the other side of the tightrope is equally fatal.
Which is what?
If you operate with too much diffidence, which in this context means overwhelming fear, excessive paranoia, and a total lack of trust, you become intolerable to be around.
Oh, man. So if you are constantly jumping at every shadow, if you execute a lieutenant every single time a whisper of disloyalty reaches your ear without verifying it, you create an environment of suffocating terror.
And eventually, your own people will rebel against you, not because they ambitiously want your power, but simply because the mental toll of living under your erratic paranoia is worse than the physical risk of overthrowing you.
You essentially force them to assassinate you just so they can get a good night's sleep.
Basically, yeah.
So, slow to believe and to move is the mechanism to survive this tightrope. Let's use another modern example. You hear a rumor that your head of sales is trying to poach your clients and start a rival firm.
Okay, good scenario.
If you are incautious, you ignore it. Oh, Sarah would never do that. We're friends. And then Sarah takes your clients.
Right.
But if you are intolerable, you immediately fire Sarah, sue her, and publicly humiliate her before you even check her emails.
And the rest of your staff watches this erratic, terrifying behavior and immediately starts updating their resumes because they realize you are a paranoid nightmare.
The temperate mode requires you to absorb the paranoia because the threat might be real, the new state is full of dangers, but completely suppress your outward reaction until the facts are verified.
You investigate prudently, you gather the data, you act with humanity while you are searching for the truth, but you maintain the absolute capacity to drop the hammer with harshness if the rumor proves accurate.
It is the ability to feel the panic of leadership without ever showing it to your followers.
And managing how your followers perceive you, balancing that threat of the hammer with the prudence of your investigation, leads us directly into the most famous, the most widely quoted, and frankly the most heavily debated concept in the entire text.
This is the ultimate question of leadership. Is it better to be loved than feared, or the reverse?
It's a question that has completely transcended the original text. I mean, you hear it in corporate boardrooms, in sports locker rooms, in mob movies. It is the fundamental binary of authority.
And the text's actual answer, when you strip away the simplified pop culture versions, is incredibly nuanced.
First, it acknowledges the absolute ideal.
Right. The author admits that the perfect scenario, the flawless execution of leadership, is to be both loved and feared simultaneously.
You want your people to feel a deep, genuine adoration for you, while simultaneously holding a terrifying respect for the consequences of crossing you.
But the author is a pragmatist above all else.
He is. What's fascinating here is his immediate pivot to brutal pragmatism. He acknowledges this ideal state, and then he immediately discards it as a practical impossibility.
He argues that putting love and fear together in equal measure for a sustained period is profoundly difficult.
Human psychology simply does not hold those two extreme contradictory states toward a single figure easily. Eventually, one emotion cannibalizes the other.
Therefore, the text concludes, if you are forced by the constraints of reality to lack one of the two, if you have to choose just one to rely upon, it is much safer to be feared than loved.
The operative phrase is much safer. Not better, not more fulfilling, but structurally safer.
And to explain why fear is a safer structural foundation for power, the text provides what has to be one of the most scathing, depressing, and cynical indictments of human nature I have ever encountered.
The author completely unloads on humanity.
He assigns 5 specific inherent traits to men. He says, as a general rule, men are ungrateful, fickle, pretenders and dissemblers, evaders of danger, eager for gain.
He strips away every comforting illusion we have about human nobility and loyalty.
I mean, let's just pause there. Ungrateful, fickle, pretenders, cowards, and greedy. Wait, is he saying everyone is just fundamentally terrible? That nobody acts out of genuine loyalty? It feels excessively dark.
It is an incredibly dark baseline,
Huh.
but we have to understand the specific context of the power dynamic the author is analyzing.
What do you mean?
He isn't talking about your relationship with your spouse or your childhood best friend or your mother. He is strictly analyzing the dynamic between a ruler and their subjects, between the leader and the led.
Ah,
In
okay.
that specific macro dynamic, the text views human loyalty as purely and unapologetically conditional. The author is observing that in the realm of politics and survival, people are driven by self-interest above all else.
Conditional loyalty. Explain the mechanics of that because the text goes into detail about how this conditionality actually plays out in real time.
So the author writes that while you do them good, people are entirely yours. While you are providing them with utility, they will offer you everything. They will offer you their blood, their property, their lives, and even their children. They will swear absolute undying loyalty to your vision and your leadership.
Because you are the source of the bounty, you are handing out the tax breaks, you are providing the military security, you are approving the promotions and the bonuses. As long as the gravy train is running on schedule, everyone in the dining car thinks you are the greatest conductor in history.
Exactly. But, and this is the critical turn, the moment where the conditional nature of the loyalty is exposed, they only offer you these ultimate sacrifices when the actual need for them is far away.
Oh, wow. So it is incredibly easy to offer your life for the king when there's a prosperous peace.
It is easy to pledge your blood when there is no war on the horizon.
It's easy to say, I'd take a bullet for you and nobody's shooting.
Yes. But the text states, when the danger actually gets close to them, when the invading army is at the gates, or when the company is facing bankruptcy and you actually need your employees to take a temporary pay cut to save the business, what do?
They revolt.
The text is utterly blunt. They revolt. The moment the relationship ceases to be a net positive for their own personal gain and becomes actively dangerous or costly to them, the love they swore to you vanishes into thin air.
Because, referring back to those 5 traits, they are evaders of danger and eager for gain. If the gain stops and the danger starts, the loyalty evaporates.
Their survival instinct overrides their affection for you.
Which leads perfectly into a concept that I found completely fascinating in these notes, the distinction between bought versus owned friendship.
This is perhaps one of the most profound psychological observations in the entire chapter.
The text draws a rigid line between transactional relationships and authentic, character-based relationships.
Yep. Right. Friendships or allegiances that are acquired at a price, meaning through money, political favors, appointments, or just the general process of doing them good, are merely bought.
But they are not owned.
Precisely. They are bought but not owned. When you buy a friendship with a favor, you are purchasing it with a currency that is entirely external to your own character.
You didn't win their loyalty through your greatness and nobility of spirit. You won it because you had the keys to the treasury.
And the fatal flaw of a bought friendship is that when the time comes to actually rely on it, when you face a crisis and need to call in your chips, the text says they cannot be spent.
The currency of bought loyalty is void in a crisis. It's like having $1 million in Monopoly money when the landlord knocks on the door demanding real rent.
That's a great way to put it. When things get dangerous, you reach into your pocket to spend that friendship, to ask them for the sacrifice they promised, and the person just walks away.
Why? Because you can't pay them to stay anymore. The transaction is over.
And this is exactly why relying on love is so incredibly dangerous for a leader, according to the mechanics of this text. Love, in the political or organizational sphere, is almost always transactional. It is a bought friendship disguised as genuine affection.
So, having established that human nature in this context is fickle, transactional, and primarily eager for gain, how do the actual mechanics of love and fear operate within that human psyche?
That's the next logical step.
If human loyalty is so unreliable, how does a leader actually enforce order? This brings us to the psychological machinery of control. The text explores the underlying mechanics of love's chain versus fear's dread.
Why, on a mechanical level, does love fail where fear succeeds? The text argues this by looking at the threshold of betrayal.
Okay.
It states that men have less hesitation to offend one who makes himself loved than one who makes himself feared.
And to offend in this context means to betray, to plot against, or to overthrow.
The barrier to betraying a beloved leader is significantly lower than the barrier to betraying a feared one.
And the reason why is rooted in a highly evocative metaphor the author uses. He says that love is held together only by a chain of obligation. I want to really dig into that specific phrasing. A chain of obligation.
It is a brilliant image because a chain implies a bond, a connection between two people. but it is ultimately a brittle one that relies on tension.
Right. Because humans are, as the text bluntly summarizes, wicked, which we can interpret here not as cartoonishly evil, but simply as fundamentally self-interested and looking out for their own survival. They will break that chain of obligation at the very first opportunity if breaking it serves their own utility.
If snapping the chain offers them a better chance at gain or a better way to evade danger, they will snap it without a second thought.
If we look closely at the psychological insight here, it is staggering. Love in the context of leadership relies entirely on the other person's continued, active, voluntary choice to honor an obligation.
Every single day, your followers have to wake up, assess their current situation, and consciously decide, I am going to honor the chain of obligation I have to my leader, even though it might be difficult today.
You are putting the structural integrity of your entire organization, your entire state, entirely in the hands of their fickle goodwill. And as we've established, their goodwill is subject to change based on the weather, their bank account, or the presence of an invading army.
Yeah, exactly. You are trusting a foundation made of sand.
Think about it like a modern subscription service.
Yeah.
Relying on love is exactly like running a streaming platform.
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
People sign up for your leadership because they like the premium content you provide. They like the perks, they feel good about the brand, they enjoy the benefits.
Sure.
But the fundamental flaw of a subscription is that the moment you fail to deliver the premium content, or the moment the economy dips and money gets tight, or the moment a rival service offers a better show, they simply hit cancel.
They do. It requires their ongoing proactive goodwill to keep paying the monthly fee of loyalty.
Right, so love is like a subscription service. People will cancel the second they need to save a few bucks.
That is a highly accurate way to modernize the concept. You are entirely at the mercy of their continuous satisfaction. But fear, the text argues, operates on a completely different mechanical system.
How so?
Fear is maintained by a dread of punishment that never forsakes you.
Fear isn't a subscription service that someone can just opt out of when they get bored. If love is a subscription, fear is like a heavy anchor. It doesn't rely on their goodwill to keep the ship in place.
The anchor doesn't ask the ocean for permission. It just exists, massive, immovable, and driven by the undeniable force of gravity.
And the gravity in this case is the human survival instinct.
Fear bypasses the intellectual, calculating part of the brain that weighs pros and cons, and it targets the limbic system. It targets the primal dread of pain, loss, and death.
You don't have to hope that your subjects wake up and voluntarily choose to be afraid of you.
Fear doesn't require an active, noble choice on their part. As long as the threat of punishment is credible, visible, and present, the dread never forsakes you.
The anchor holds regardless of whether they find a better deal elsewhere, because the cost of trying to swim away is too terrifying to contemplate.
It takes the unpredictable variable of human choice completely out of the equation.
You aren't asking them to choose you out of the goodness of their hearts. You are structuring the environment so that it is functionally impossible for them to choose anything else without facing catastrophic, unacceptable consequences.
Which is why, mathematically speaking, within the cold logic of the text, fear is the definitively safer foundation for a leader.
Because it relies on a biological constant.
Yes, the desire to avoid pain rather than a psychological variable, like the feeling of gratitude.
Okay, I understand the logic. It's cold, it's brutal, but mechanically it makes sense. But here is where I have a massive problem with this theory, and I imagine anyone listening who has ever dealt with a tyrannical boss has the same problem.
Let's hear the pushback.
This sounds incredibly precarious in the long run. If a leader is just walking around terrifying everyone, constantly wielding this heavy anchor of fear and dread, isn't there a massive risk of blowback?
Oh, absolutely.
If you push people into a corner with relentless fear, eventually they stop being afraid and they just become enraged, right? A cornered animal bites. Don't tyrants usually end up being overthrown by the very people they terrified?
They absolutely do. History is littered with the corpses of tyrants who thought fear was a blank check for abuse. And the author anticipates this exact counterargument.
Oh, he does.
He knows that fear is a volatile substance. This brings us to what is perhaps the most brilliant, nuanced, and critical part of the entire chapter. It is the governor on the engine of fear.
We can call it the golden rule of tyranny.
The absolute necessity of maintaining fear without hatred.
The distinction between fear and hatred. Here's where it gets really interesting.
It is the most important distinction in the entire source material. If you take away only one conceptual framework from this entire deep dive, it should be this: there is a monumental functional difference between making someone fear you and making someone hate you.
The text states the rule explicitly. A prince must make himself feared in such a way that, if he does not acquire love, he escapes hatred.
It definitively argues that being feared and not being hated can go together very well. They are not mutually exclusive.
It is the perfect, necessary balance for survival.
You must maintain the dread of punishment to keep order, but you must never, under any circumstances, let that dread curdle into visceral, personal hatred.
Because fear paralyzes people. It keeps them compliant, quiet, and obedient.
But hatred, however, mobilizes people. Hatred removes the fear of consequence. It makes them willing to risk their own lives, willing to die just to see you fall.
If your people truly hate you, no amount of guards, no amount of fear, and no amount of punishment will keep you safe.
They will poison your wine, they will mutiny in the dark, they will find a way to destroy you, regardless of the cost to themselves.
So the million-dollar question is, how do you execute this? How do you walk around being this formidable, terrifying figure who wields the dread of punishment over an entire state, but successfully avoid making the people hate you?
The text actually provides a highly specific checklist. It gives us the rules for avoiding hatred.
Okay, let's hear the rules.
Rule number 1, and he stresses this above all else: abstain from the property of citizens and subjects.
Do not touch their stuff. Do not steal their wealth.
Rule number 2, abstain from their women.
Which speaks very clearly to the historical and patriarchal context of the 16th century, but fundamentally, translated to a broader principle, it means do not violate their families, do not touch their personal honor, and do not humiliate them in their private lives.
And rule number 3, if you find it necessary to take someone's life, if you must spill blood to maintain the state, do it only when there is suitable justification and manifest cause.
Meaning, you cannot just execute a courtier because you are in a bad mood, or because you are bored, or because you secretly want their estate.
No. The violence has to be public, it has to be clearly justified by the laws of the state, and the people have to understand exactly why the punishment happened.
The rules of fear must be predictable.
Exactly. Predictability is the antidote to hatred. If punishment is random and arbitrary, it breeds sheer terror, which quickly ferments into hatred, because no one feels safe regardless of how well they behave.
But if punishment is the strict, inevitable, and logical consequence of breaking a known rule, it breeds fearful respect.
The subjects think the leader is harsh, but he is fair. If I follow the rules, I am safe.
Now, in explaining these rules, specifically the paramount rule about not touching people's property, the text delivers what I think is the most jaw-dropping, cynical, and perhaps uncomfortably honest quote of the entire book.
The observation about grief versus economics.
Yes. Here's the quote. Men forget the death of a father more quickly than the loss of a patrimony.
Let's just pause on that.
Let me just repeat that slowly because the implications are staggering. Men forget the murder of their own father faster than they forget the loss of their inheritance, their property, their wealth.
We really need to unpack this incredibly dark assessment of humanity, because on its face, it sounds monstrous. It sounds like the author is just trying to be edgy or provide shock value.
Right. Why would he claim that a human being cares more about their wallet than their own parent's life? It feels offensive to our sensibilities.
It does. But when you force yourself to think about it strictly through the grim, mechanical logic of the text, well, it actually makes perfect, devastating sense.
How so?
Because grief, as profound and terrible as it is, naturally fades over time. The acute, paralyzing pain of mourning a parent lessens as the years go by.
You learn to live with the loss.
It is a psychological and biological inevitability. We are designed to heal from emotional wounds. The anger associated with the father's death eventually dulls into a sad memory. But poverty, economic ruin.
That is a daily, relentless physical reminder.
If a tyrant executes your father for treason, you cry, you mourn, you bury him, and eventually life goes on.
But if a tyrant seizes your family farm, if he steals your business, every single morning when you wake up hungry, every time you look at your children wearing rags instead of the fine clothes they used to wear, every time you freeze in the winter because you can't afford firewood, you are actively, physically reminded of the tyrant who took your wealth.
The anger never fades because the consequence is a daily lived reality. It is a wound that is ripped open every single day.
Furthermore, the text notes a deeply practical, operational reason for avoiding the theft of property. It states that causes for taking away property are never lacking.
What the author means is that if a leader starts stealing from their subjects to fund their lavish lifestyle, to build palaces, or to pay for endless wars, they will never ever stop.
It becomes an administrative addiction.
The text warns that he who begins to live by rapine, meaning by plunder and extortion, always finds an excuse to seize more. There is always a reason to need more money.
It's an endless cycle. If you steal from one rich merchant today, you'll need to steal from 2 tomorrow.
And eventually you guarantee that you will steal from everyone, thereby guaranteeing that the entire population will eventually hate you.
Whereas, the author notes, causes for taking a life are rarer and disappear more quickly.
You discover a conspiracy, you execute the traitor, and the event is definitively over. The fear of your justice is firmly established in the minds of the public, but the daily irritation to the broader population is gone.
The problem is solved. If you take their house, the irritation lasts for generations, breeding future conspirators. Let's pull this out of the 16th century and apply it to the listener's modern reality.
I think that's a great exercise.
Think about the dynamics of your own workplace or industry. Obviously, your boss isn't executing anyone in the break room, and they aren't literally plundering your family farm.
I would hope not.
But the psychology of fear and property translates perfectly. Think about a demanding, uncompromising boss. They can be incredibly strict. They can be highly feared.
You might be terrified of walking into a performance review underprepared because you know they will ruthlessly hold you accountable.
But as long as that strict boss is fundamentally fair, as long as the rules are clear, you probably don't hate them. You might even deeply respect them for driving the team to excellence.
But observe what happens the moment that exact same strict boss crosses a line into personal unfairness, specifically regarding what an employee considers their property.
Exactly. The moment that demanding boss steals your credit for a massive project you worked on for 6 months, which is effectively touching your professional patrimony, your reputation, or the moment they unjustly mess with your promised bonus to pad their own metrics, or publicly humiliate you for a mistake that was actually their fault, the dynamic shatters.
The fearful respect instantly curdles into venomous hatred.
Productivity collapses. You stop trying to excel and start trying to survive, or worse, sabotage. They touched your livelihood unjustly, they violated the terms of the transaction, and they are suddenly the enemy.
The golden rule of tyranny holds up perfectly in a corporate structure. You can be feared as a highly demanding leader, but the second you are perceived as an unjust thief of your team's hard-earned rewards or honor, you are hated, and your team will actively work to undermine you.
It is a phenomenal translation of 16th century statecraft into 21st century organizational psychology. The mechanism of human resentment remains entirely unchanged.
It really does.
Okay, so we've established the rigid rules for governing civilians and maintaining a stable organization. You can use fear as a heavy anchor, but you absolutely cannot touch their property or their personal honor without just cause. Otherwise, that fear turns to hatred and they will destroy you.
But that brings us to the final major section of the text, and it introduces a massive variable.
Section 6, the military exception. The question the author poses is, do these same rules of delicate balance apply when you are leading a massive army in a time of war?
And the text gives a resounding, unequivocal no. The rules of civil governance are thrown out the window.
The calculus changes entirely when you are dealing with the raw, concentrated violence of the military. The text asserts that when a prince is commanding a multitude of soldiers, when he is in the field with the army, he must not care about a name for cruelty.
In fact, it goes further. It argues that without a reputation for absolute, unyielding cruelty, an army can never be held united or disposed to action.
To illustrate this extreme exception, the author provides a third, highly specific historical case study, Hannibal.
The legendary Carthaginian general who accomplished the impossible by marching his army, including war elephants, across the Alps to attack Rome.
The text points out several critical factors about Hannibal's situation. He led a massive army, but more importantly, it was an army composed of infinite kinds of men.
These were not patriotic citizens fighting for their homeland. They were mercenaries, they were allied tribes from different cultures, people speaking dozens of different languages with entirely different customs and gods.
And he led this incredibly volatile mixture of armed men in alien lands, far from home, deep behind enemy lines in Italy for years on end.
When you look at those variables, it is a recipe for absolute catastrophic mutiny.
You have a massive group of disparate, heavily armed, highly violent men who only care about getting paid and surviving. They are stuck in a hostile country with no easy way home, facing the greatest military machine in the world.
By all conventional logic, they should have fractured. They should have turned on each other over rations, or they should have assassinated Hannibal and surrendered to Rome for a bounty.
Yet the text notes the historical miracle. There was never any dissension, never a mutiny, not a single recorded instance of the army fracturing against itself, and never a rebellion against Hannibal's authority.
And this held true across extreme spectrums of circumstance. It held true in good fortune, when they were winning brilliant victories at Cannae and drowning in Roman loot, and it held true in bad fortune when they were starving, freezing, and losing ground.
And what does the text credit for this miraculous sustained unity among infinite kinds of men?
It doesn't credit his charisma, it doesn't credit his speeches.
It credits one thing solely: Hannibal's inhuman cruelty.
Yes, the author specifically pairs this inhuman cruelty with Hannibal's infinite virtues.
The text acknowledges that Hannibal was a genius. He possessed supreme strategic brilliance, immense personal bravery, and tactical mastery.
But the core argument is that the combination of his brilliant virtues and his terrifying, inhuman cruelty is what made him, in the exact words of the text, venerable and terrible in the sight of his soldiers.
Venerable and terrible, revered for his genius, but utterly paralyzingly feared for his brutality.
The author explicitly states the counterfactual. Without the cruelty, his other virtues would not have been enough.
If Hannibal had been a brilliant strategist, a brave fighter, but a kind, forgiving, merciful man who didn't ruthlessly execute deserters or brutally punish insubordination, that army of mercenaries would have torn itself apart.
The moment the gold ran out, or the moment a battle looked too dangerous, the chain of obligation would have snapped. The inhuman cruelty was the necessary structural binding agent that held the infinite kinds of men together in the face of impossible odds.
Which leads to a really fascinating, biting critique of history itself. The author uses this example to take a massive shot at historical writers, philosophers, and the general public's understanding of how the world actually works.
It is a profound critique of intellectual hypocrisy and moral cognitive dissonance.
Yes. The author claims that historians look at Hannibal and they marvel at his achievements. They admire this action of his meaning. They write glowing books about his incredibly united, disciplined, successful army and his tactical genius.
But on the other hand, in the exact same breath, these historians condemn the principal cause of it. They condemn the inhuman cruelty that made the discipline possible in the first place.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it perfectly encapsulates society's cognitive dissonance regarding power and order.
We as a society desperately want the great, peaceful, organized outcomes. We want the trains to run on time. We want the borders to be secure. We want the chaotic, violent elements of the world to be kept at bay so we can live comfortably.
But we fundamentally refuse to acknowledge, and we morally condemn, the harsh, messy, brutal realities that are required to secure those comfortable outcomes. We want the surgeon to cure the patient, to bring us back to health, but we write entire moral treatises condemning the surgeon for using a bone saw.
We want the perfect omelet, but we weep for the broken eggs, and we call the chef a monster for cracking them.
The author is essentially calling out the philosophers and historians of his day as naive hypocrites who enjoy the fruits of a stable state but refuse to look at the blood required to fertilize the roots.
He is demanding that the reader look at cause and effect, without the blurring lens of moral sentimentality. If you want the miracle of Hannibal's united army, you must accept the reality of Hannibal's cruelty. The universe does not allow you to have one without the other.
And that uncompromising demand to look at reality exactly as it functions rather than how we wish it functioned brings us full circle to the mission we set out on at the very beginning of this deep dive.
It certainly does. We have traversed an immense amount of incredibly difficult, challenging philosophical terrain today. We have looked into the darkest corners of human motivation.
So let's do a quick synthesis of the journey we've taken through these sources. We started by dismantling the modern definition of mercy. We saw how mercy, if used simply as a tool to make the leader feel morally pure, as Florence did with Pistoia, can actually cause mass suffering and destroy the whole universality.
Conversely, we saw how Borgia's targeted cruelty acted as a surgical intervention that brought peace.
We then examined the tragic, inescapable burden of the new leader. We saw how the volatile vacuum of a new state, the newness of the kingdom, compels a leader to maintain a harsh watch.
Yet they must survive the psychological tightrope of the temperate mode, carefully balancing between being blindly incautious and paralyzingly intolerable.
We tackled the ultimate question of leadership. loved or feared. And in doing so, we confronted a deeply cynical view of human nature.
We learned why relying on the fragile chain of obligation, which is easily broken by self-interest and danger, is vastly inferior to relying on the enduring, heavy anchor of fear and the dread of punishment.
We explored the fatal weakness of bought friendships versus those owned through greatness of spirit.
Crucially, we defined the absolute golden rule of survival for any leader relying on fear, that fear must never ever curdle into hatred.
And the primary mechanism for avoiding that hatred is respecting boundaries, specifically never touching a subject's property or honor unjustly, because we learned the grim truth that men will forgive the murder of their father long before they forgive the theft of their inheritance.
And finally, we looked at the military exception, the harsh, undeniable reality of Hannibal's success, and the hypocrisy of a society that loves the order a great leader provides, but cowardly condemns the cruelty required to forge it.
The core value for you in taking the time to understand the mechanics of this text isn't about giving you a permission slip to become a tyrant in your office or a manipulator in your home. That is the pop culture misreading of the text.
The true value is developing a profound, completely unfiltered understanding of human incentives. It forces us to strip away our romanticized, Disney-fied views of how people should behave in a perfect world, and look clearly at how they actually behave when the pressure is on, when money is tight, and when their personal interests are threatened.
It forces us to ask very uncomfortable but deeply necessary questions about the foundations of our own lives. Are our leadership styles, our professional networks, and our relationships built on bought obligations that will collapse under pressure, or are they built on genuine mutual respect?
And that leads me to a final provocative thought I want to leave you with today.
I want you to genuinely mull this over as you go about the rest of your week. Apply the cold logic of this 16th century text directly to your 21st century life. Think about your professional circles. Think about your networking contacts, your colleagues, and maybe even some of your personal relationships.
If a sudden catastrophic crisis hit tomorrow, if you lost your job, your title, your influence, your wealth, your ability to do favors, essentially, if all the benefits you currently provide to others were instantly removed, who in your circle would stay beside you, purely out of greatness and ability of spirit?
And who would instantly break the chain of obligation because your existence no longer serves their utility? Are you currently relying on love, on a fragile transactional subscription of goodwill, in areas of your life where you should actually be establishing firm boundaries, clear consequences, and a healthy, respected dread of crossing you?
Think about it.
We started today talking about the murky, uncomfortable waters of diagnosing reality when the comforting moral X-ray machine is broken. This text doesn't give us a clean, easy, feel-good picture of humanity, but it does give us a brilliantly ground lens to see the shadows beneath the water clearly.
It really does.
Thank you for taking this profound journey with us. As always, we are the Deep Dive, helping you understand the mechanics beneath the surface so you can be brilliantly, uncomfortably, and powerfully well-informed. Until next time.